Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Good to see you, Daniel.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
I am doing very well, and I thought we'd talk about foreign policy. Can you imagine that?
No, we can't do that, can we?
Yeah. You know, we'd be so bored if they all of a sudden decided tomorrow to have a non-interventionist foreign policy, and we just stayed at home. We say, hey, this is great. We can go on vacation. But you know what? That's not likely to happen in the near future. I mean, even though I think it's slightly more popular to mention the name, the word. It used to be, isolationism, but I think we've changed that a little bit, and they talk about non-intervention a little bit more. But there's lots of interventions going on, and there's been some changes. And you know, when I think about what's happened just recently with the CIA, we had the head of the CIA become the Secretary of State. Yeah. Then we had the assistant who worked for the Secretary of State is now head of the CIA. So I see them as partners now, partners in crime. In many ways, it's criminal on what kind of foreign policy we have. But you know, during the Reagan era, there was a saying always when things weren't going quite right and Reagan wasn't being hardcore, they say, they'd talk to the staff. Just let Reagan be Reagan. Let Reagan be. Well, Reagan was Reagan and is Reagan. I mean, what do you mean? He appoints all these people, but I don't think they're going to say that about Trump. I think one of our problems is Trump, and we're starting to realize who he really is because we look at his cabinet and we see neocons everywhere. We see them under the bushes and every place, and you know we have the Pompeo and Haspel involved at high levels, and Bolton, you know, a major advisor, and then the United Nations, which is a PR arm of the administration. And she's a little hawkish, you know, she tends toward hawkishness. So, and then I think early on, just as it was with the Reagan administration, the appointment to the vice presidency is very important. And the neocons feel safe. At least they got a guy backed up there. And I think that's the reason, one of the reasons why the chaos of trying to get rid of a sitting president is they're not worried about that. I don't think they're making headways in getting, you know, an impeachment or something like that. But they always know they have a Pence there and maybe a fallback later on. But, you know, last week we saw Haspel sworn in and a lot of attention, a lot of talk about torture and her so-called denial. Oh, I don't believe in that so much anymore. And all the stories we heard. And now we have the Secretary of State probably giving the most significant speech on foreign policy, especially on Iran, you know, at the Heritage Foundation. Yeah. Heritage tends to lean toward the neocon position.
Just a little.
You know, they represent the military-industrial complex. So, but Pompeo gave a significant speech, a long speech, detailed speech about all the things that we must do. And to say the least, it was no olive branch. What we heard was threats and intimidations and all the challenges there. It did nothing to bring about a more sensible diplomatic understanding of how the world works. So it wasn't very optimistic speech, but in one way, if you look for the optimism, it was so over the top that nobody's going to believe him. Nobody believes it's going to work, and it'll help drive the wedge that we have talked about, the loss of credibility with our so-called European allies, who are again just about fed up with this, who tend to like to work with Iran, and this offers nothing. This offers nothing except more hostility. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. But what Pompeo was saying, the likelihood of saying, oh, this is it. These are the rules. 6 months, this is all going to be accomplished, and we're going to have a different government in Iran. Well, you know, let's not hold our breath for that.
Exactly, and you're right. It is significant that it was given at Heritage, because Heritage, like most of the other Beltway think tanks, are literally funded by the military-industrial complex. That's where their money comes from. So they're not going to be out there preaching diplomacy and peace. So the speech itself was so transparently riddled with falsehoods and out-and-out lies, it's hard to imagine the incompetence, if that's what it was, to put things out that were so insane. Stephen Walt, a professor at Harvard, an expert on the region, he wrote, this reminds him of the 1914 ultimatum to Serbia, which was designed to fail to lead to war. And that seems exactly what his 12 points are designed to. And I've got a few from his comments, but from the 12 demands, Moon of Alabama had a good piece. We both read that this morning. He said it's the incompetence of the Trump administration is unbelievable. Stop all uranium enrichment. Of course, they're not going to do that, and they had the right to do it under the IAE, under the NPT, Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The other one, close the heavy water reactors. It can't close it because it doesn't have any. It already closed them under the very agreement that Trump pulled out of. You know, they closed Arak. They poured concrete down the middle of it so it could never be reopened. So how did that get in there? It's just amazing. So the Moon of Alabama concludes that the Trump administration has no way to reach the goals, and that may be by design.
Yeah, that is the case because I think their goal is regime change, and yet at the same time they do this, what they do is they solidify a regime. The moderates and the radicals in Iran, there's always factions. They come together. When somebody really gets together to attack a country, it's just the same way in the U.S. It was justifiable and understandable that on 9/11, you know, there wasn't so much Republicans and Democrats picking at each other behind the scenes maybe. But, you know, people came together because they felt like the attack came from outside. And when the attack comes from the outside of Iran, people come together. So even if they have some people there that would change it, but they've already moved in the right direction. You know, they're not as radical as they were 10, 15 years ago. They've moved in a direction that made them even come along and agree not to develop nuclear power. And yet we just say, well, forget it. We don't. You haven't done enough, and these are the demands, and they keep threatening. It's always a military threat. If you don't do what, you know, subtly, it's a military threat. So if you don't do what we tell you, so it's a threat that's not going to go by idly. And some of this is actually going to backfire on us when you think about the giving up of some gas development by the French. And guess who wants to? Well, we'll take over the project. Let's do it. China.
Yeah.
And then we complain about China taking over the world. And all they do is sell us stuff, make some profit, spend some money, and invest in Iran. Yeah. And what do? We fight with them. It makes no sense at all.
And the other one of his 12 demands of Iran is completely abandon your ballistic missile program, which is, who would do that? It's insane because this is primarily a defensive. The missiles they're developing are not capable of carrying nuclear warheads. They are simply to defend itself against its enemies, of which there are many in the region, including that map we keep showing about the U.S. bases all around Iran. They've got Israel as an enemy, Saudi Arabia as an enemy. So we're telling them, you have no right to defend yourself. You just have to sit there like, what country would do that?
You know, and then of course there'll be an effect on what's going on in Syria too, because you know, Iran has you know, an interest in there, and they have assistance and putting on demands there. That's just going to cause more chaos there, and it's not going to help anything there other than the fact that the neocons are celebrating probably. And I often wonder, wouldn't it be something to listen to the discussion of Bill Kristol and Dick Cheney on weeks like this? And of course they would pretend that they're not really in charge, but I don't know, Dick Cheney may brag about it.
Yeah, that's true. And you mentioned Syria. You know, if you just look at his speeches, the 12 demands are one thing, but just the speech, it is so riddled with outright falsehoods. And actually a lot of projection. We accuse Iran of doing what the U.S. is doing, Pompeo does. Here's one thing he said: Iran has pumped thousands of fighters into Syria to prop up the murderous Assad regime and help make that country 71,000 square miles of kill zone. Okay, well, who has the right to be in Syria? Between Iran and the U.S. Iran was invited in by the legal government. It is an ally, so you have no right to have allies. This is what Pompeo was saying. And who was the U.S. supporting in Syria? You know, we know this, supporting al-Nusra Front, by default supporting al-Qaeda, weapons getting into the hands of ISIS, all of the jihadists. So you don't have to love Iran to see objectively Iran and Syria, along with Russia, were fighting jihadists who we're supposed to be enemies of.
You know, and condemning Iran for dealing with Al-Qaeda, that doesn't make any sense. What if you were asked to make a comparison between what we have done, you know, in working with Al-Qaeda versus what Iran has done? It was sort of like the Iraqi thing. You know, we built these lies up that Saddam Hussein was part of the Al-Qaeda and 9/11 attacks. Well, the same thing here. I don't think there's any real evidence that they use Al-Qaeda to fight their battles for them.
On the contrary, they're bitter enemies. Al-Qaeda are radical Sunni jihadists. You couldn't have more of an enemy of the Shia than that. And that is another one of his claims. He says, Pompeo says, Iran continues to serve as a sanctuary for Al-Qaeda. No, that's actually not true. In fact, it is true about one of our allies, though, and that is Israel. In August of 2017, the former head of the Mossad, Ephraim Halevi, told Al Jazeera he admitted that Israel has supported Al-Qaeda in Syria. So even the former head of the Mossad says, yes, no, it's us. We're the ones that have been doing it. It's not Iran. Iran is mortal enemies of Al-Qaeda.
You know, and of course, Pompeo said they're going to have the worst sanctions placed on any country ever, and it's coming, and there's all this argument and intimidation. But let's say nothing major happens other than the fact that the United States has to start living up to these threats. Otherwise, they might lose credibility, I think. Let's be thankful for that happen. But if they did have this breathing room where we can start incrementally making it worse for Iran, I wonder exactly what they would do. And the big question is, what would the Europeans do? Because you read two sides of that. Sometimes I think the Europeans are more fed up with us than ever before, and they're getting more independent. At the same time, as you see them, you know, changing, like the French said, well, maybe we better back off from that. So we don't know where they're going to stand on this, but it certainly is a different atmosphere than I'd say, you know, a year or two or three ago. That they did exactly what we told them, especially when it came to the British. But even the British statement was not super strong in support of what Pompeo was saying.
And Boris Johnson, the foreign minister of the UK, is a Washington sycophant, no question about it. But he was pretty strong in saying the U.S. is off the wrong course on this. But you know, the thing about this U.S. policy toward Iran is that there's no way to win from Washington's perspective, because either the Europeans do not go along with us, in which case the U.S. is going it alone. Talk about being an isolationist, totally isolated. I don't think that's going to happen. But even if that doesn't happen, we've already seen that BP, I think British Petroleum, is thinking about pulling out or starting to pull out. I think you'll see some kind of tactical withdrawals of some of these countries. But even if the Europeans do cave to Washington, that opens the door, as you mentioned earlier, completely wide to China, Russia, India, and other countries in the East to come in and increase their influence and increase their investments.
And the big question is can they find alternative routes for financial transactions? How can they pay for their oil? And they use the SWIFT operation, which we can close down and deny it to them. But then there's others who argue, well, we'll just do it direct. And I think they have had direct deals, and they've used the euro to do this. Of course, China wants to move in and start, and they have started. But I think this slow going to use an alternative currency and maybe use the yuan as a reserve currency. But that's a long time coming. But the big thing is how effective can they be in selling their oil? Because for Iran to exist, they have to sell the oil. Mm-hmm. But they have some friends over there now. You know, maybe India won't be hostile to that. China won't be hostile. They're setting in. They picked up on some of their developments. Russia's certainly going to help them. And they have to facilitate trade. If they can sell something to China or Russia, I mean, we surely can't get in there and blockade everything. And actually, this was part of this deal, is they're talking about the possibility of this leading to a naval blockade. Not that we don't have them, closed in already on the map that you mentioned. They're surrounded by nukes, and at the same time they're talking about, well, if these Iranians get in there and they want to actually trade some of their goods and survive, we're going to put a navy around here. That has to be one serious big move, because if you put them in a corner, some ship is going to get blown up, and who will blow it up, we don't know. It could be a false flag, and it also invites problems at the Straits of Hormuz. You know, if they're going to close down Iranian trade, what if they close down the Persian Gulf? Yeah. So that would be a big escalation, and then maybe the thoughts about how World War I started. People better restudy that history.
Yeah, it's, you know, Washington's bombastic foreign policy is a kind of slow motion national suicide, because as you point out, nobody wants to go to the yuan, nobody wants to go to the euro. They wanted the path of least resistance to continue the dollar, but we're forcing, the neocons, the interventionists are forcing us to become irrelevant, forcing Washington to become irrelevant and to be out of the picture. But you mentioned, a false flag, a war. This is an interesting article from the Huffington Post a few years ago. But the U.S. did a war game in 2002 called Millennium Challenge, if you remember. Mm-hmm. They spent $250 million gaming a war with Iran to see what it would look like. And it turns out the results were so devastating for the U.S. that they suspended the exercise, and they changed the parameters to ensure that we would win and say, oh, look, we got it. So it's not to say that we're necessarily militarily weak. We spend more than most of the world combined. However, when the people that are doing the war games decide it's not going to be as easy as people like Pompeo and a lot of the other people like Trump and Bolton, quote, I had other priorities in Vietnam, think it might be.
And it is said that the best laid plans for going to war almost fail about 24 hours after it starts, because they can't anticipate exactly what's going to happen. But they can and they should, be anticipating, the pros and cons of diplomacy and dealing with people and talking about free trade rather than and legitimate trade rather than this bombastic intimidation and threats. It makes no sense whatsoever, and that's why, even though it wasn't super strong what Boris Johnson said, it still is an eye-opener. They say, hey, America's going in the wrong direction. And unfortunately, I'm back to the thing that this hope Trump doesn't be Trump any longer. Not in the sense his policy should change. Yeah. We don't need that encouragement. But still the question is he sounds like this Iranian thing he's doing exactly what he said. His strong supporters will love it, and they believe everything they're doing there, and it's necessary, and that the Iranians are the worst people in the world, and they never ask the questions, well, if I'm a Christian and I have to live in that region of the world, or if I'm Jewish and I can't live in Israel, which country should I go to? Saudi Arabia? Yeah, sure, they'd go there. They'd probably go to Syria or Iran, but that's, they never ask that question. People are easily intimidated, by the propaganda, and unfortunately, the deep state has control of the propaganda.
Exactly. And I can't help but feel, indulge me just a couple of more pieces from his speech that were such outrageous lies and so repulsive. But the one that really almost made me nauseated was when he talked about Yemen. He said, in Yemen, Iran's support for the Houthi militia fuels a conflict that continues to starve the Yemeni people and hold them under the threat of terror. Talk about blaming the victim, as if somehow from the sky war started and it was all Iran's fault. No, it was the invasion by Saudi Arabia in 2015 that did this. Never you see the word Saudi Arabia. It's all Iran's fault for helping the victims, the people that are getting attacked. It's so sick. And the other quick one, he says Iran supports the Taliban. Totally untrue. Why don't we ask the provincial governor Abdul Salangi, who just said earlier this month, he reiterated again just last week, there's no evidence that Iran supports the Taliban. So this is just a pack of lies designed to bamboozle Americans, just like they did with Iraq, just like they did with Libya. It's the same pack of lies. It's the same neocon claptrap. And, hopefully it'll be refuted. I am concerned about what this might mean.
Right. And I would just add to your statement about Yemen is who are the allies in the war, the Saudi war against Yemen? Well, they just happen to be the United States and Israel, and they're the ones who participate in it, not literally, but indirectly in providing of information and weaponry and all this, and everybody knows this. But there are certain things that won't be talked about on our media. Matter of fact, most Americans have probably totally forgotten about Yemen. You know, I don't think we hear enough about it, and the other things get the attention, but not the war in Yemen. But once again, I think that dangerous direction that we're going in. You wonder whether the so-called improvements with North Korea are just a decoy and a temporary reprieve so that we take our mind off that and say, you know, yeah, this is what we're really working for, because Trump is going to win the Nobel Peace Prize, you know, and get people thinking two different things. It remains to be seen how that works out. Let's hope they, even if they did want to use it as a decoy, I hope it surprises them and works, and they have to live up to, you know, better relationship with North Korea. But that remains to be seen. But non-intervention is still the answer to these many problems, and people have to understand that non-intervention is not isolationism, and the type of thing that we argue for is for an integrated world. People will trade and talk and travel and visit with each other, and unified by a voluntary market type of currency, which would really help. Not a fiat currency dominated by the United States, and it runs the world through the financial markets that we can use with a bludgeon over anybody that won't do what we tell them. And since we're the powerful military nation, if they don't do what we tell them financially, then we say, well, you better watch out. We have drones and other things, and we have a lot of allies, and we might participate in just forcing you or convincing you that you best go along with us. I think we've tried this out for a long time, matter of fact, to some degree for 100 years, but certainly during this century, these last 18 years has just been horrible in us being involved, and that is the reason that the empire is rather strong and very powerful, but also looking like it may be turning the corner and the empire is becoming weaker, and that should be good news, because that means liberty has a chance as long as we have the individuals in this country who understand it and want to promote liberty over authoritarianism that we have been living with for so long. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.